But unfortunately, a constitutional right to access abortion services is not actually a thing. The so-called rights that we have had to access abortion services in this country were granted via court rulings, not the Constitution or any national level laws. And the consistent repetition of that inaccurate phrase is one of the reasons why I think so many people, especially young people, are so surprised by the possible loss of access to abortion services in some states in this country. We've been misled for our entire lives to think that we've had a constitutionally protected right, but that's never been true. And the refusal of the previous generations to make sure that it was a right protected in law is how we ended up here. Congress makes the laws, not the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is responsible for interpreting current law in our most difficult of cases. Had any national law, and especially the Constitution, had said that women have the right to access abortion services and doctors have the right to perform them, then we wouldn't be having this national conversation right now. Instead, the states have been making the laws that govern abortion, and any rights that we thought we had since the early 1970s have come from, again, Supreme Court decisions about those state laws.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, darling, and thank you for listening to the 252nd episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, first of all, thanks for checking it out. Happy to have you here. But basically, this is not a typical political show. I am obsessed with governing because I feel like I am a taxpayer who wants to know what Congress is doing after the elections. I want to know what they're doing with my money and in my name. And I, in general, want to judge if I am getting enough of a return on my federal tax investment. And so the way that I've been researching all of this and reporting it is that I read bills and laws and watch hearings, and I tell you whatever I think it's important for you to know that I just don't think is being covered in the national media the way it should be. And today's episode is right along those lines of like, there's a big story in this country, and I don't think it's being covered the way that it should be. And so today's episode is designed to help you decide if you want to vote to keep your member of Congress, if abortion is now near the top of your priority list, now that it looks very likely that the Supreme Court is about to reverse previous Supreme Court decisions that were serving to guarantee all Americans access to the medical procedure of abortion since the early 1970s. But here's one thing that I want to make clear right up top. I'm not trying to preach at you. I know that this is a very heated topic and there's a lot of emotions on every side. And I truly feel for this episode, how I feel about it is irrelevant. And so I'm not here to try and convince you to feel the way I do. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about how I feel. If you are someone who cares, I have talked about my opinions on this on the internet on the new show, the new podcast that I am starting with Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton. It's called We're Not Wrong. And our first episode or two, not sure, but I do know that they are on the internet now. And the first episode we recorded was about Roe v. Wade. It was before I had read the bill in detail, so it really is our opinions on the topic. So if you're someone that cares, go and find We're Not Wrong and listen to that episode and subscribe if you enjoy the new show, because we have a lot of fun recording it. Basically, the show is three people who our main podcasts are either in the political or governing or history realm. We pay more attention than average people. But we are all friends who like to find compromises and are friendly even when we disagree with each other. We are laughing and we're having a good time because we are also very well aware that we don't have the power to change anything, so why be a jerk about it? So we have a lot of fun talking about really controversial topics. And so, yeah, that's what we're aiming to do. It's a place for us to air our opinions and have some fun. And yeah, First episode was Roe v. Wade. But here on Congressional Dish today, my aim is to tell you what is in the Women's Health Protection Act, which is the bill that would govern abortion access nationwide, which the Democrats wrote, and which Senate Republicans and Democratic agenda spoiler Joe Manchin are not allowing to pass through the Senate. So this has passed the House. My crystal ball tells me that's as far as it's going to go. But my goal in doing a whole episode about this is to give you accurate information about what exactly the Democrats propose to be law from the text of their bill itself. And I carefully studied every single word. But by knowing what exactly the bill would and would not do, because there were a lot of inaccuracies being flung around by people who either clearly didn't read the bill or were straight up lying about it, both on corporate news and in the halls of Congress. But armed with actual facts, I'm aiming to allow you to make an informed judgment for yourself about whether or not the Democratic Party's proposal for governing abortion rights is a fair compromise. Because that's what I'm looking for, a fair compromise. Because this is one of those topics, abortion is one of those topics where how everyone feels is justified. Everyone in general is right. Because it's very reasonable to think that it's wrong to force a person to use their body to cook up a new human for 9 months if they don't want to. It is reasonable to see this as a basic freedom issue. And in general, that is what the Democrats were saying in the House floor debate that took place in September 2021. So here's Representative Jan Schakowsky of Illinois.
Women can make the decision to have a child or not have a child. It is about bodily autonomy.
Here's Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York.
America is the land of the free and the home of the brave, but we cannot truly be a free country unless women have the freedom to make their own health care decisions.
And here's Representative Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut.
Everyone, everywhere should have the freedom to make their own personal health care decisions without interference from politicians.
That seems pretty reasonable. But it's also reasonable to view a new human life, even when it's being formed, as a baby and to want that little baby to live. So here's Republican Representative Vicky Hartzler.
I rise in opposition to this bill, which isn't about freedom for women. It's about death for babies.
Here's Republican Christopher Smith of New Jersey.
This bill constitutes an existential threat to unborn babies.
Gentlemen.
And here's Senator John Cornyn of Texas.
America cannot be its best if we do not value the lives of our most vulnerable. I believe babies, fellow human beings with heartbeats, fingerprints, just like the rest of us, deserve to have protection under the law.
That is reasonable. Everyone has a good point here. So the goal has to be a compromise among people who all have good intentions. We have to find a balance between freedom for the mother and rights for the baby. But before we can get into the Democrats' idea for that compromise, we need to examine where we currently are. Because there has been so much said about abortion in the last few weeks, and so much of it has been just wrong. So for starters, the idea that we have had a constitutional right to access abortion services is present in the bill itself. It's in the findings section of the House bill. And it's also been repeated over and over again by Democrats in Congress. So here's my former representative, Catherine Clark of Massachusetts.
It is the Constitution that gives people the right to make a decision about abortion with their families, their doctor, and in accordance with their faith.
And here's the Speaker of the House, Representative Nancy Pelosi of California.
And advocating the Women's Health Protection Act. And we are standing on the side of women to defend their freedoms and to uphold this truth. Every woman, everywhere, has the constitutional right to basic reproductive health care, no matter what state you live in.
But unfortunately, a constitutional right to access abortion services is not actually a thing. The so-called rights that we have had to access abortion services in this country were granted via court rulings, not the Constitution or any national level laws. And the consistent repetition of that inaccurate phrase is one of the reasons why I think so many people, especially young people, are so surprised by the possible loss of access to abortion services in some states in this country. We've been misled for our entire lives to think that we've had a constitutionally protected right, but that's never been true. And the refusal of the previous generations to make sure that it was a right protected in law is how we ended up here. Congress makes the laws, not the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is responsible for interpreting current law in our most difficult of cases. Had any national law, and especially the Constitution, had said that women have the right to access abortion services and doctors have the right to perform them, then we wouldn't be having this national conversation right now. Instead, the states have been making the laws that govern abortion, and any rights that we thought we had since the early 1970s have come from, again, Supreme Court decisions about those state laws. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about 3 abortion-related cases that went to the Supreme Court. They are nicknamed Roe, Casey, and Dobbs, and they happened in that order. But I'm going to use those nicknames because it's just easier than saying the whole things every time. But the most famous court decision, of course, was Roe versus Wade. In the 1970s, Norma Mccorvey, who was known anonymously at the time as Jane Roe, she got pregnant in Texas and sued the state of Texas because the people of the state of Texas, who care so much about individual liberty, well, the people of Texas made it a crime for doctors to perform abortions and for pregnant people to try to get one at any stage of the pregnancy, unless the pregnant person can prove that they were about to die without one. And by the way, the only way you can definitively prove that you're about to die is to die. And so Jane Roe sued the state of Texas, and her case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in the Roe versus Wade ruling ruled that Jane Roe and the rest of us do have a constitutionally protected right to privacy, which the Supreme Court said was guaranteed by 5 different amendments to the Constitution, which, by the way, those amendments don't actually say that we have a specific right to privacy either. But regardless, the Supreme Court in 1973 ruled that the right to privacy extends to an individual's right to control their own pregnancy, but they also said that's only true up until a point. So in Roe versus Wade, the state of Texas had argued that their state government had a duty to protect the life of the unborn. But Texas claimed that that life begins at the time of conception, and the court did not agree with that. But the problem was that the Constitution doesn't actually define when a person is indeed a person. And even though Congress has bothered to define what is and is not an electric bicycle, Congress hasn't bothered to define when a fetus becomes an actual person either. So the 1973 Supreme Court looked to what the Constitution does say, which is that the Constitution protects those that are, quote, born or naturalized, unquote. And they said that that wouldn't include a fetus because, now quoting from the Roe versus Wade decision, quote, the unborn have never been recognized in the law as persons in the whole sense, unquote. That said, the court in the Roe versus Wade decision also disagreed with Jane Roe because her side argued that she and all women had an absolute right to get an abortion whenever she wanted, for whatever reason, in whatever way she chooses. And the Supreme Court disagreed and decided that states should have the ability to regulate some abortions. And so to deal with this, the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade created a framework that laid out the rules depending on the stages of a pregnancy. The Supreme Court created a 3-trimester system with different rules depending on the trimester. In the first trimester, so the first 12 weeks, the court ruled that a state could not regulate abortion except to require that they be performed by a licensed doctor in safe conditions. In the second trimester, which is weeks 12 through 24, the court ruled that the states should be allowed to regulate abortion as long as the life of the pregnant person is protected. And beyond 24 weeks, the court ruled that the states could ban abortions as long as there were exceptions for abortions that would be needed to save the life of the pregnant person. After this Roe versus Wade decision was released, the number of abortions in the United States didn't really change. What did change, however, was there was a dramatic decrease in the number of deaths of pregnant women who didn't want to be pregnant because they were able to get their abortions legally and safely because they would be performed by professional healthcare providers. And so that life-saving 3-trimester framework created by the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade governed abortions nationally until 1992, when the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, as in Robert Casey, who at the time was the governor of Pennsylvania. In that follow-up case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Planned Parenthood sued the government of Pennsylvania because of the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act of 1982. That Pennsylvania law had 5 provisions that Planned Parenthood identified as making it harder for women to get abortions. And I think of these as like nuisance laws. These exist for the idea that if you can put up enough obstacles, the pregnant person will either run out of time to get an abortion or will just give up. They basically try to annoy doctors and pregnant people as much as possible to make getting abortions harder. And in Pennsylvania, they put in 5 requirements that were challenged in court. So one was Pennsylvania required a 24-hour waiting period between deciding to have an abortion and undergoing the procedure, which in reality means that the pregnant person has to go to and pay for 2 office visits instead of 1. Pennsylvania also enacted reporting requirements on facilities offering abortions. So these were paperwork nuisances and privacy issues too. Doctors in Pennsylvania were also required to tell women considering abortion only about potential negative impacts on their health. So it wasn't like they were required to have a pro and con conversation. It was all cons required, which is clearly not balanced or medically necessary. Fourth, Pennsylvania also required that pregnant girls under the age of 18 get consent from a parent or guardian before they can get their abortion, which is kind of problematic if your parent or guardian is abusive, and this wouldn't go over well. And then fifth, Pennsylvania required women to give notice to their husbands before getting an abortion. And fun fact about that paternalistic bullshit, during this case's road trip to the Supreme Court, a lower court said that all of these were fine except for that ridiculous you have to tell your husband one, because husbands don't own us. That's my problem with that, in case that isn't clear. Now, at the time, Samuel Alito was on that lower court, but he thought that the husband one was okay too. Flash forward, Samuel Alito is now a Supreme Court justice, and he is the one that wrote the Supreme Court opinion that leaked, the one that reverses Roe versus Wade and Casey. So basically, I'm just telling you that Samuel Alito sucks. But when Casey did get to the Supreme Court, the court upheld that the pregnant person, via their right to privacy, still had the right to choose abortion. But instead of the framework created by Roe versus Wade, the one that divided the rules by trimester, the court in Casey changed the rules so the states could regulate based on fetal viability, which is the fetus's ability to survive outside of the pregnant person. At the time, in 1992, that time of fetal viability was believed to be around 28 weeks. But here's the problem with that standard. Things change. Medical advancements make modern day miracles possible and have made survival for the fetus possible earlier in the pregnancy cycle. So in 2017, Lila Strensrud was born at 21 weeks, making her the most premature baby to survive. And so in my head, 21 weeks, because Lila lives, it's possible for that to be the viability mark because others can survive at that point too. We know it can happen. But because viability isn't precisely defined, there is now this window of about 7 weeks where there's legal wiggle room allowed when it comes to are abortions allowed. It's not as clear as the trimester system envisioned in the Roe versus Wade decision. It's been fuzzier since 1992. And there have been other cases related to abortion, other things that have been tweaked. But those cases were the 2 most important. Those are the cases that are probably about to get erased by the Supreme Court. And that probably is important because I want to make it crystal clear that as of this recording, that's not a done deal yet. When the Supreme Court makes a decision, they write long explanations about those decisions, and they take months to write them. And we, the public, don't see the first drafts of what they're writing until they're done. But someone who works in the Supreme Court made a copy of Alito's rough draft and released it to the world. And it's not normal to know about a decision before it's been made, which is why this is a weird situation. Abortion is still legal everywhere until fetal viability, wherever that line may be for the doctor who's making the decision, which is generally through the end of the second trimester. But again, the end date isn't really set yet, but that's still the law of the land. But I want to make it very clear that we are having these feelings over a draft. The final decision could be different, and we will know what that final decision is sometime this year. But again, as of this recording, abortion is still being governed nationally on the parameters set by the Supreme Courts of the past. National policy hasn't been changed. But when the final decision is released, here's the backstory on the case that they will be deciding with that decision. So the case that Alito and his, I don't know, maybe they're friends up on the Supreme Court right now. The case that they're deciding is Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, which is a case that challenged a Mississippi law that made abortions illegal after 15 weeks of pregnancy or 3 weeks into the second trimester, unless there's a medical emergency or a, quote, severe fetal abnormality, unquote. Now, the law in Mississippi never went into effect because a federal appeals court said that the state of Mississippi, I hate that word, Mississippi, too many S's, it's just not good for podcasting. But basically, the law never went into effect because the state of Mississippi didn't show any medical proof that a fetus could survive outside of the mother as a baby at 15 weeks because it's never happened. And that would be necessary for the law to go into effect because remember, the previous Supreme Court changed the rules in Casey to say that abortions couldn't be restricted before fetal viability. And the earliest known baby to survive outside its mother was born at 21 weeks. So 15 weeks, you know, Mississippi wanted to make everything after 15 illegal. And so that's what the case is about. Basically, Mississippi is arguing that an abortion ban that includes exceptions to protect the health of the mother after 15 weeks doesn't impose an undue burden on getting an abortion, even though it's before fetal viability, because the vast majority of abortions, we're talking over 90%, are completed by the time of 15 weeks into a pregnancy. But because of the nature of this challenge, challenging where that line should be, what this means is that if Mississippi wins the case, which Samuel Alito's rough draft says Mississippi probably will, well, then the line would no longer be the point of fetal liability because 15 weeks is clearly not it. And quite frankly, it's unclear what the line would be instead, which is basically the cause of this national freakout. Each state, in the absence of a national law, would get to set that line individually. And it is very reasonable to believe that this will limit abortion access in a significantly large amount of territory in the United States because of the laws that are already on the books in some of our states. So, for example, that 1970s Texas law that led to the original Roe versus Wade decision, the Texas law that bans abortions at the point of conception, the point when the spermy and the eggy merge to make a cell cluster that the naked eye can't even see. Well, that ban at conception law, the ban at that point, is still on the books in Texas. There's also a more recent Texas law that's actually in effect right now, and it's not much better. The current Texas law bans abortions at 6 weeks, the point when the cell cluster is the size of a pea and some electrical activity can be detected on an ultrasound, which is not a heartbeat, by the way, because there is no heart at this stage. Like I said, the whole thing is the size of a pea. And many women don't even know that they're pregnant at 6 weeks because that's just one missed period. That could just be like stress or hormones or whatever. And again, it's the size of a pea. And so you're probably not showing. In fact, there's no way you are. And so basically, the draft decision that we saw from the Supreme Court, it implies by straight up saying so, that the issue of abortion would be governed by the legislatures, governed by laws written in the states and or in Congress. And so if this is in fact the decision that will be issued by the Supreme Court sometime later this year, Each state would make its own rules unless Congress creates a national law. Letting states decide in the absence of a national law, there is realistic potential for some locations to exist in this country where all first trimester abortions, when the cell cluster is a cell cluster no bigger than the size of a pea, it is reasonable, if not likely, to believe that first trimester abortions will be illegal in some parts of the United States. And in those parts we're concerned about, those states are neighbors, which means that, let's just name it, the southeastern quarter of the country could have an effective regional ban on safe first trimester abortions. That is actually possible if the Supreme Court does what we think it's about to do. But we don't know exactly what the future will look like yet, largely because we don't know what the Supreme Court is going to actually say yet. And Congress has done nothing to settle the issue, despite promises to do so from both parties for as long as I've been alive. And so when I look at this, I'm not really harboring any anger towards the Supreme Court. And there's been a lot of anger towards the Supreme Court. And I do get it because, Samuel Alito just generally sucks as a person. And this is upsetting if you're someone who's concerned about the lives of pregnant people. But I'm not upset with the Supreme Court. I think that is a misdirected anger because the Supreme Court should not be governing abortion anyway. The Supreme Court isn't supposed to write the rules. Congress needed to make a law to guarantee the right to receive or perform an abortion. And Congress needed to define when clusters of cells have developed enough to be considered a wholly different person from the mother. And Congress needed to define what states could regulate and what they couldn't. And Congress has not done that. The people in Congress, by not doing their jobs, are the ultimate cause of this. And that's also where the ultimate solution lies as well. And that's why this is a topic that's being covered on Congressional Dish, because this is a Congress thing. And to their credit, the Democrats in this Congress have been trying to make a national law, and it's called the Women's Health Protection Act. Like I said before, it passed the House of Representatives, and it's currently dying in the Senate. And just to be clear, because you can go into the show notes and look at these, there are actually two different versions of the Women's Health Protection Act. One is a House bill and one is a Senate bill. But the only difference between the two of them is that the House version had a findings section in it, which is like a preachy segment where they list a bunch of reasons that their bill exists. But the Senate version doesn't have that preachy segment. But the parts that mattered, the parts that govern, they were exactly the same word for word. And so you can judge your representative in the House and the Senate based on this description, even though they're technically two different bills if you want to go to the show notes and look them up. But it is also fair to call this the Democrats' bill. All but one of the Democrats voted for it in the House, and all but one of them voted for it in the Senate. On the other side, not a single Republican in Congress voted yes. But as for the Democrats' actual proposal, here's the goal of their bill. Here's the good intention, which this bill actually really would do. So here's Representative Frank Pallone of New Jersey.
Now is the time to pass this legislation and ensure women's health care rights are enshrined in federal law.
Which is a very important thing that needs to get done, and preferably before the final draft of the Supreme Court decision is published, and there is real-world chaos for doctors and pregnant couples who don't want to have a kid. So what the bill would do is it would give healthcare providers the right to provide abortion services if they want to. And it gives patients the right to receive abortion services without, and then the bill lists a whole bunch of limitations or requirements that it would be illegal for the states to implement. So it would be illegal for the states to limit abortions, quote, at any point or points in time prior to fetal viability, unquote. Now, when it comes to what viability would be defined as in law, they did not put a week number on this. Again, a living person, her name is Lila, was born and she survived at 21 weeks. But instead of making the point of viability when the youngest known survivor preemie was born, instead this bill defines viability to mean the point at a pregnancy in which, quote, the good faith medical judgment of the treating healthcare provider based on the particular facts of the case before the healthcare provider, unquote. In that healthcare provider's judgment, there is a reasonable likelihood of the baby surviving. And so it's really up to the healthcare provider where that line is going to be, which means that Kathy McMorris Rogers, who is a Republican who's very much against this, it means that she isn't wrong when she said this.
Under this bill, viability is whatever the abortionist deems it to be.
She's not wrong. Viability is not clearly defined in the Democrats' bill. It's left up to the doctors. Now, in practice, most doctors right now consider viability to be around 24 weeks, but the bill doesn't say that. And so individual doctors would be the ones empowered to draw that line. The viability standard being chosen by the Democrats also means that their bill doesn't actually codify Roe versus Wade. It codifies Casey. And there is a significant difference between those two, with Casey being the worst of the two options because it's not as clear as the 3-trimester structure from Roe versus Wade. And that's just a significant difference from what's been said by the Democrats about their bill. Here's 4 Democratic senators, Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and Tammy Duckworth of Illinois during the Senate debate on this bill on May 10th.
The Women's Health Protection Act of 2022, which I lead with Senator Blumenthal, would indeed codify Roe versus Wade.
The Women's Health Protection Act, it does codify Roe versus Wade. The Women's Health Protection Act will do all of that by codifying Roe to affirm it as the law of the land.
The Women's Health Protection Act, which would codify Roe v. Wade once and for all.
It makes me crazy that these people care so little about accuracy in their explanations, especially when the difference between what they are saying and reality are so significant. Because people knowledgeable about those two cases would reasonably assume that the 3-trimester framework would be in the bill if they hear from members of Congress that this codifies Roe versus Wade. And members of Congress are the people who should be most in the know. And yet that assumption, that reasonable assumption, would be wrong. It's a big difference. And this is why I don't think that the Democrats in Congress took all that much time to examine their own bill. Now, they probably didn't study the details as close as I did, because in their warped political land up there in D.C., why bother? Because it isn't going to pass the Senate anyway. But to me, I see this as they gave up before the effort even began. And that's one of, if not the most frustrating things about the Democratic Party. They don't do the things they say they're going to do. They pretend to try and then fundraise off their failures, saying that, well, we just need more money and more Democrats before we can actually do anything with our power. And them not knowing the huge difference between codifying Roe and codifying Casey, which is what they actually did, it's just a huge red flag for me, signaling that this was a message bill, not a genuine attempt at lawmaking. Now, to be fair, the debate that you've been hearing clips from, most of them anyway, in the House, if you can call it a debate in the House, well, the debate-ish and the vote happened before we got to read the leaked draft from the Supreme Court. But the thing is, it's not like they didn't know that Dobbs was being deliberated by a Trump-packed court. The Democrats have been fundraising on the possibility of this happening for a while. And you would hope that this would be a more serious effort than one of their standard messaging bills from the past when there really wasn't any threat to Roe v. Wade or Casey. But this is one of the bills that they passed to pretend that they tried. But I think that this is pretend. So take that for what you will. But that said, this is their official proposal in writing. And so let's blast through the rest of the bill so that you can know what's in it. So we've already established that this codifies the Casey method of drawing the line on what can be banned, allowing states to ban away after fetal viability. However, their bill also says that the states could only ban abortions, quote, after fetal viability when, in the good faith medical judgment of the treating healthcare provider, continuation of the pregnancy would pose a risk to the pregnant person's life or health, unquote. And the way that I read that, the health part, I think that could include mental health. And so after fetal viability, when it is a baby, doctors and patients would have some subjective, so based on the doctor's word, wiggle room to perform late-term abortions, and not just to save the life of the mother or prevent suffering of the baby. The exemptions could be broader than that. But I also want to be very clear. That wiggle room would not allow late-term abortions for like any reason. It would have to be a medical necessity as determined and stated by a doctor, which is a standard that already exists in every one of the 43 states that have currently banned late-term abortions. Exceptions to late-term abortion bans are not controversial in reality, and they do not mean that a pregnant person can just abort a baby that could live on its own just because she didn't want to do the whole kid thing anymore. That's just not the case. Now, moving on, the bill would also prohibit some of the nuisance obstacles to getting an abortion that some states have placed between pregnant people and the procedure. So the bill would stop states from limiting a healthcare provider's ability to provide drugs to a patient, because some abortions themselves are drugs. Actually, a lot of them are like this. They're done early in the pregnancy, and apparently you take some pills, get a really heavy period, and then you're not pregnant anymore. And so all abortions are not surgeries. And so, making sure a state doesn't prohibit the pill kind is important. And also some states have classified people, qualified people who perform abortions at clinics like Planned Parenthood as like not real doctors in order to make their jobs harder. And so this prevents the states from cutting off doctors from prescribing things like pain medication, for example, which I have to imagine pain meds might be necessary before or after some surgeries. The Democrats' bill would also stop states from preventing the healthcare provider from performing abortion services via telemedicine, which is important in case, say, there's a rural patient who lives far away from everyone that needs guidance doing the pill kind of abortion at home. The Democrats' bill would also stop states from requiring the patient attend medically unnecessary pre-abortion in-person office visits, which you might remember was an issue in the Pennsylvania Casey case. The bill would also stop states from requiring doctors to perform specific tests or medical procedures prior to an abortion, unnecessary and cost-increasing tests, just to make abortions more time-consuming and expensive. The Democrats' bill would also stop states from requiring that healthcare providers provide medically inaccurate information before or during abortion services. So like requiring providers hand out a pamphlet telling you scary things about abortions, even though it's an extremely safe procedure. When performed by a professional, abortion-related serious injuries and deaths are extremely rare, which is why a lot of people would like to have the ability to get one from professionals instead of some dude with a coat hanger in the back of an alley. Or at least before the baby is a baby. I think there's a lot of people that would like the ability to get abortions from qualified people to be an actual right. And like I said before, after Roe versus Wade was decided, the rates of abortion-related deaths plummeted because the procedure didn't have to be done in the shadows. The Democrats' bill would also stop states from limiting abortions in facilities that are not in hospitals, which allows, Planned Parenthood and similar clinics to do what they need to do. The bill would also stop states from requiring patients disclose the reason that they want an abortion prior to fetal viability. So before fetal viability, a pregnant person could get an abortion for none of your damn business. There's a real right to privacy in there. And then I also think it's important to note that there are a few things that this bill says specifically that the federal government would not be governing, that would be leaving alone and leaving fully up to the states. And so some of those are, for instance, the feds would have to stay out of state laws governing security and physical access to clinic entrances. The feds would stay out of insurance coverage for abortions. And so insurance and companies that just have, religious thoughts about abortions, they can still refuse to cover them if this were to become law. The feds would stay out of contracts for abortions. And then the feds would also leave alone bans on partial birth abortions. And so let me say that again. Any bans on partial birth abortions, which are nightmare fuel, I won't go into detail because it's like ripping a baby apart. It's horrible, but those can remain fully banned. Nothing would change in regard to those. There are also instructions in the bill for how the courts would have to handle abortion-related cases in the future, which the most important thing to know is that they would be judging a state's actions, like the state's laws, whatever they are trying to enact, based on if their requirement interferes with a doctor's ability to provide abortion care or poses a risk to the patient's health or safety. The courts would judge if a state requirement would likely delay or stop some patients from accessing abortion services. The courts would consider if the requirement is likely to increase the financial costs of providing or getting abortion services. The courts would consider if the requirement would likely limit the availability of abortion services in a state or geographic region, looking at you, the South. And then the courts would look at if the state requirement imposes penalties on healthcare providers that are not imposed on or are more severe than penalties imposed on other healthcare providers for comparable conduct or failures to act. Basically, if the state's requirements do any of those things, the state would lose the case in court. And I do want to make an important observation here because I keep saying the states, and I want to be clear that that's on purpose. Because the bill says that this would apply to the federal government and the states. It does not include the territories in this text. And so the way I read this, I don't think these protections would extend to doctors and pregnant women in Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, any of these territories, these locations that are controlled by the U.S. government, but haven't been granted statehood and therefore don't have as many rights. They'd be left out of all of this. Now, this is an easy fix. They would just have to add "and territories" to the bill. But this is just another red flag to me. It's a fairly enormous oversight. And that makes me think that this bill, again, just wasn't a serious effort because this is a sloppy mistake. So now you know what the Democrats did. Now you know what the Women's Health Protection Act actually is. You got the details and you can judge whether or not you would like for that to become law for yourself. But I also want to take a minute here before we wrap this up and look at the politics of all this. So first off, the Democrats. They passed a message bill. In my judgment, not a serious effort, but the bill did outline what the Democratic Party thinks would be the best way to guarantee women's access to abortion services early in their pregnancies nationwide. It would make access to abortions a legal right, if anything, for longer than some of us are comfortable with. All but 2 Democrats in this current Congress voted for this. The only no vote in the House was Henry Culler of Texas, and the only no vote in the Senate by Democrats was, no surprise here, Joe Manchin, another guy who just sucks. And as for the independents in the Senate, both Angus King and Bernie Sanders joined the Democrats and voted yes. As for the Republicans, all of them, literally all of them, voted no. And the Republicans' behavior when it comes to the debate on this bill, so many of them chose to just get out there on the House and Senate floor and just lie. Here's Representative Tim Walberg, Republican of Michigan.
The bill before us would ban virtually all conscience protections for medical personnel.
No, it wouldn't. This bill gives doctors the option to perform abortions. No one would be forced to perform them. That's crystal clear in the text. Here's another liar, Senator John Cornyn, a Republican of Texas.
Any healthcare provider who had a deeply held religious or moral objection to abortion would be required by federal law to provide them anyway.
Nope, just not true. Here's another lie being told by Michelle Fischbach, a Republican of Minnesota.
The Abortion on Demand Act would not only strip states of their rights to protect women and babies, but it would also strip away a parent's right to be involved and informed on their child's health and well-being.
Nope. You heard all the limitations that wouldn't be allowed. Parental consent requirements were not in the bill, not on the list. They would be allowed. And then there were so many lies about the most important aspect of this bill, the viability line. Again, the bill allows a state to ban abortion starting after the viability line if they want to, but the viability line is unclear. But the after-fetal viability bans would have to allow them, if necessary, to protect a pregnant person's life or health. That's it. That's the only exception that is required or that would be required in federal law. So put another way, third trimester abortions would be banned by states with exemptions that allow to protect the pregnant person's life. Third trimester abortion bans, like I already said, exist in 43 states, and every one of them has that exception in it, and nothing about those laws would change. And the 7 states that don't have bans right now would be free to enact them on third trimester abortions anytime they wish. And yet the Republicans said, here's Representative Larry Bouchon, a Republican of Indiana.
The inappropriately named Women's Health Protection Act of 2021 would codify the ability to obtain abortions for any reason at any point in pregnancy.
For any reason? Nope. Here's another one, Kathy McMorris Rogers, Republican of Washington.
Abortion for any reason, at any stage of pregnancy, until birth is not the will of the American people.
And it's not in the Democrats' bill. But that fact didn't stop this lie coming from Virginia Fox, Republican in North Carolina.
But this latest Democrat scheme would go against the wishes of the American people and make abortion on demand for any reason until the time of birth.
Nope, just not true. But even those lies don't compete with the biggest whopper that I heard. Here's Representative Diana Harshbarger of Tennessee.
And under this law, every state will be a late-term abortion state, where abortions can be performed until birth for any reason with no accountability or protections for women.
Just no! That's not real. You cannot look at this bill and think that that's true. And so either they didn't read the bill and are just saying things, which is totally possible, or these were straight up lies. And as if the lying about what the bill actually does wasn't bad enough, they also clearly passed around one of their talking points memos with a fun little label that they could use in their floor performances. Here's Representative Lisa McClain of Michigan.
This act is titled the Women's Health Protection Act, more properly titled Abortion on Demand Act.
Brett Guthrie of Kentucky and Gus Bilrakis of Florida, they understood the assignment.
I rise in opposition to the Democrats' abortion on demand until birth bill.
I rise today in strong opposition to the Abortion on Demand Until Birth Act.
So clever. Although it was kind of weird when Michelle Fischbach made it sound like she came up with it.
It should be called the Abortion on Demand bill.
But whoever came up with it, Republican after Republican, used it. Like Mike Pence's dopey brother Greg used it for his big picture message.
History will not look kindly on this abortion on demand legislation.
And Jackie Walorski of Indiana, she used it in her speech, which can easily double as a soap opera audition for the amount of drama that she brought to the floor.
This abortion on demand bill would destroy our country's future.
And then there's Tim Walberg and Kathy McMorris Rogers, who mixed that clever bill title and the until birth lie and made themselves a fun little bullshit cocktail.
It's an extreme bill that would impose abortion on demand nationwide up until birth.
The Abortion on Demand Until Birth Act is extreme.
The childishness and unseriousness of this debate was extreme. And it was a really depressing thing to see. Because both sides, and one, the Republicans, far worse than the other, but both sides said things that were just not true. Accuracy was not much of a concern. And it was clear that both sides were not in any way trying to find a compromise. The debate was simply a series of self-righteous speeches, which is so tragic because after reading the bills, I know that this issue is solvable. And yes, by the Republicans and Democrats. Because despite the words coming out of their annoying mouths, the words on paper, the bills written about abortions by these two parties, they're not all that far apart. So back in 2013, I read a bill about abortion that passed the House of Representatives. It got to the same exact stage as this one, but that one was written by the Republicans. The vote back then was 228 to 196, almost right down party lines, with all but 6 Republicans voting yes and all but 5 Democrats voting no. But in the findings section of the Republicans' bill, the Republicans said, quote, pain receptors are present throughout the unborn child's entire body and nerves linked to these receptors to the brain's thalamus and subcortical plate by no later than 20 weeks after fertilization, unquote. And so their bill allowed abortions to be banned after that pain point, which they identified as 20 weeks. And they included exceptions too. So they allowed late-term abortions in the Republican bill if they were needed to save the mother's life or if the pregnancy was the result of rape or incest and was reported to law enforcement. The Republicans' bill, though, did provide stiff penalties. So if this became law and it was broken, the healthcare provider could face a fine or up to 5 years in prison. Now, I will acknowledge that these are wildly different approaches to dealing with the abortion issue because the Democrats' bill would ensure rights for doctors and patients, and Republicans went the punitive route and would hand doctors prison sentences. But the line of when a baby is what I want to point out here. The The Republicans in their bill said 20 weeks. And the Democrats in theirs said viability. And again, little Lila was born and survived at 21 weeks. So that's viability. And that's a difference of 1 week. There's clearly opportunity for compromise when it comes to the definition of when a cell cluster has matured into a baby. And what can be done about their different motivations? What can be done about the fact that Democrats want rights and Republicans want bans? Well, how about a bill with both, inspired by Roe versus Wade's 3-trimester framework? So my proposal is that in the first trimester, up to 12 weeks, well before proven viability, but encompassing the window when the vast majority of abortions are performed, make abortions legal nationwide. No reasons required. It's no one's business. But then second trimester, leave it up to the states. So that if California wants to allow them up to 24 weeks, which is the most common practiced viability line, fine. But if Texas wants to ban abortions, with exceptions, of course, starting at 12 weeks, also fine. Let the states decide in that messy zone of the second trimester. But then the third trimester, 24 weeks through birth, when we know that the baby is viable and it is a baby, abortion ban nationwide. Unless medically essential to the physical life of the mother or the baby, of course. But we know that babies can survive after 24 weeks. It's a person in hiding at that point. And maybe that person should have rights. And this was clearly the Republicans' biggest problem with the bill. It was the lack of a ban. Here's Brett Guthrie again from Kentucky.
This does not prevent states from making abortions legal in the third trimester.
And here's Julia Letlow of Louisiana.
I do not understand how we can pass this bill, a law that will allow an abortion to be performed up until the actual moment of birth, despite the fact that the child has a fully developed heart and can feel pain.
Like I said before, everyone is right when it comes to abortions. At a certain point, and we know it's 24 weeks or earlier, there is a baby there. It can survive without the mother. It's not a cluster of cells. And so these concerns, they're not just rhetoric. They're real. Again, third trimester abortion bans already exist in 43 states, and every one of them has exceptions to protect the life of the mother. And so why can't we make that national law? It would only affect 7 states, which, by the way, in case you're curious, the states that allow late-term abortions are Alaska, Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico, New Jersey, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and not all of those are blue. So there is a clear path for compromise in actually codifying Roe versus Wade's framework into law. It could have rights guaranteed and a ban. And both sides win, as they should, because like I said, both sides are right. And so I am encouraged to know that this is a solvable issue. And it's not even all that hard to imagine the details. But it's the behavior of our members of Congress which is standing in the way of that compromise becoming a law. Because one thing was clear in their debate. It wasn't a debate. They weren't working to craft a real bill. Both sides were just saying things without regard to accuracy, probably because we know that they don't study these bills, and they know that we don't study these bills. And so why be accurate when no one will know the difference? But I just witnessed something that was all a bad faith effort. It was fodder for fundraising, the end. Our problems are not getting solved because these people, these 535 people, their culture inside of our Congress in DC, it's unprofessional. It's worse than like the worst high school, because I don't think anyone's high school is split into 2 money-hungry tribes that just say horrible things to each other. Our problems are solvable, but these people, they have proven themselves incapable of doing it. There needs to be a new culture, a new group dynamic in the just 535 people. That's all we're talking about here, that we send to make our entire country's laws and financial decisions. Because I've met us Americans, and I know that we absolutely can send better people than this. We have brilliant, reasonable humans in the United States, but no one normal right now wants to go to that toxic high school on the Hill. With so many super mean people who don't give each other any benefit of the doubt and who just want to do speeches and don't want to do debates. We have Nancy Pelosi as our national Regina George. And Mitch McConnell is the coolest in the Senate. He's the captain of the football team. Ugh, I'd rather go to that high school that put Paris Hilton in solitary confinement than spend time with these people. But the problem is that despite their high school-like behavior, it's not just some awful high school full of losers that we can just ignore. These are the people making our laws. We are not sending our best and our brightest. We are not sending those among us who are the most serious about governing. We're sending professional campaigners and campaign fundraisers. We're hiring people with the wrong set of skills. And we don't have to, and really shouldn't, keep selecting from these two groups of mean girl losers. We can do better than this, America. And at some point, we have to. And in November, we have another election. We have our next chance to make a big change to hire better people. And it's a process that's already begun because the candidates are getting whittled down already in the primaries. At least, in the two corporate mean girl parties, they're having their primaries. But again, we don't have to vote for them. But the point is that our next chance to act is right now. Unfortunately, my educated guess is that we will end up wasting this opportunity like we've wasted all the others in my lifetime and hire most of these terrible lawmakers back for another term. That bill that I read in 2013, the Republican bill, 91 of the people who voted yes on that are still in Congress, 40% of them a decade later. And we wonder why it feels like nothing is changing. And actually, especially on issues like abortion, getting worse. Things are getting more chaotic, the future more uncertain. But if the lawmakers don't change, then the country won't change. It can't change. But if we ever choose to vote in people based on their governing experience and ideas and values, instead of rewarding party loyalty and fundraising, then our problems really are solvable. There are compromises, especially on this issue, that could be had. It's possible. They are so close already, 1 week apart, if they would actually speak to each other and debate for real. But in the meantime, you now know what the Democrats did and what they would propose at the negotiating table if they were ever to try to find it. And you now know how the Republicans behaved and what they voted against. And so if you want to be the change that we need and vote based on governing, I hope this helped you. And thanks for listening. Today, I have a very special treat for you, which is that instead of me telling you why you should support this listener-supported podcast, I'm going to let one of you tell everyone why you should support this listener-supported podcast. Because Claire has been a producer of this show for quite a while. And she recently, as in last summer, became my actual production assistant. And she is the one who has made our show notes even more useful than they were before because they're just so easy to use. They're now so easy to find the article you're looking for, the document or the outline of the bill or the sound clip. She's taken the information that I was just putting in there. I was just labeling them like article, document, sound clips. That's how it was for years and years. But Claire, as a listener, has changed and transformed our show notes to be so much better so that you can look up the things that I tell you to verify what I'm telling you is true. I don't think that you should just trust me. I think trust is earned, and the show notes are how we do that. So the show notes are now Claire's baby. And so today I would like you to hear directly from Claire because I talk about her all the time and you are benefiting from her work. And so here is Claire. She is going to, first of all, tell you why she supports the show, but then also she did some research for us for how you can best use the show notes in all of the different locations where they're found. So here is Claire.
Hi, everyone. This is Claire, Jen's production assistant. I'm here to introduce myself and to tell you about why I love and support Congressional Dish. So I've been working on Congressional Dish since August of 2021, but I've been a listener since 2018. A little bit about me. I was a history major in college, and I've always been interested in politics and government. After college, I worked as a server for a few years, And then I got my master's in library and information science and started working as a librarian. So I have experience in archives, but my real passion is teaching people how to do research. And it was during my time in graduate school that I discovered Congressional Dish. And I found something that I was really missing in other political or news podcasts, which is that Jen presented facts that were backed up with sources that she had cited. And those sources there were a lot of them, and they were varied, not just from, one side or another. So I've also always appreciated the fact that Jen, she's really always clear as to whether she's expressing an opinion or sharing information that she's found in her research, which I find is not so common. Since I've started working with Jen, I've actually become even more impressed with the show, just seeing the volume of research that she's doing for every episode, just finding the sources, doing the reading and the listening, making sense of the information, or writing and recording the podcasts would be like huge tasks on their own. And the fact that Jen produces a podcast every other week is literally unbelievable, just considering the volume of reading and research and all of that she does. So just seeing all that makes me really grateful that she does it so that we don't have to, because I don't want to read that much. So that's why I support Congressional Dish. On a separate note, I wanted to give a little bit of advice about the show notes and using them. So I hope that you're checking them out, at least glancing at them every once in a while. If you are, and you're looking for information in the show notes, I really recommend the best way to do that is on congressionaldish.com on the episode page. That's where the formatting is going to look the best, with all the headings set up really nicely, and the links and the images are all going to be there. I also did some research to see which podcast apps display the show notes the best, and then which ones are basically, unusable when it comes to viewing or interacting with the show notes. Because when I started listening, I was using Apple Podcasts, and I was kind of underwhelmed by the show notes because it presents them in a way that basically you can't use, and I didn't realize to go on the website. So that's what I would say. But as for the apps that are the best, the top 5 that I found were Spotify, Overcast, which is what I use, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, and Pocket Cast. And then the worst ones, which basically either don't display the show notes at all or show them just like as a chunk of text without the links, are Apple Podcasts, Audible, Pandora, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Castbox. So I would say definitely if you are using those and you are looking for something in the show notes, just go right to the website, congressionaldish.com, to use the show notes there. If you're using some of the better ones, it's totally possible to just use those to kind of navigate the show notes. But I do recommend, again, for the best experience, to go to congressionaldish.com. So that is all for me, and thank you for listening. Bye.
How fun was that to hear another voice on the show? So yeah, thank you, Claire, for being amazing, our resident archivist who's made the show notes so much better. And thanks for doing that research with all the different apps, because it is fascinating how different they perform. Some of them, you just go to the notes section while you're listening to the podcast and you can click on the link and the article opens right there inside the podcast app. It's beautiful. And then some of the other ones, it looks like one very long run-on paragraph where there are no links, and we are completely powerless to change that. So yeah, thanks for doing the research to let us know which ones work the best, because to be honest, I hadn't even heard of some of these apps. So yeah, very much appreciated. And by the way, if you're a producer of Congressional Dish, if you're someone who's been donating and supporting this show, and you would like to tell the rest of the listeners why you are supporting the show, I would be happy to hear some other voices on Congressional Dish, because to be completely honest with you, the part of the show where I have to tell you why you should donate to the show and how to do it, this is my least favorite part of doing this job. I love the listener supported model. I love value for value. I love the business model. I think it is the most ethical way to be in media right now as someone who's giving new information. But it does still feel just real icky and awkward sometimes. So if you're a supporter of the show, one of the ways that you can, and please try and keep it to about a minute, but if you want to have your voice be heard and talk to the rest of the community, you can leave a voicemail at 339-707-0307. That's our congressional voicemail box. Or if you have better equipment, because good sound quality is always appreciated. But if you have equipment and you can send us an MP3, just email me and we can figure out how to do that, whether you share a Dropbox link or, whatever. There's a bunch of different ways to transfer files to us. But yeah, I love hearing your reasons for donating to the show. And it actually helps me to know why you're donating to the show. So yeah, that is an option for you if you're interested in doing this part of the show for me, because I appreciate it so much being able to skip this segment. So yeah, thanks, Claire. I appreciate you in every way. I also appreciate the few new patrons that we've gotten. The show is still down from where we were at the beginning of April. Our community is hurting. I know that this is a tough financial time, but if you are doing okay and you can support the show right now, that would be very much appreciated. I also would like to thank Jamie Kilstein. So for those of you who are supporting the show and have access to my green room, which is my nickname for the feed that's available is that a word? The most easiest? Okay. I'm not saying this correctly. You can access the green room easiest via Patreon. There you go. That's a sentence. But also, if you want to pay for the show with Zelle or Venmo or PayPal or paper checks or Pop Money or Bitcoin, like whatever, we accept it all. And I do have a jerry-rigged way to get you that feed. But most people do it through Patreon. But anyway, if you have access to the green room because you have donated and you're now a producer of this show, I do have a conversation. I don't even want to call it an interview because it was a conversation with comedian Jamie Kilstein. And it was because I told you earlier in the episode that I'm starting this new show with two friends, Justin and Andrew, and it's an opinion show. And I've been pretty careful about not being myself, my flawed, messy self on the internet. And I was really struggling with the decision. And so Jamie came to my hotel and we talked it out. And so at the end of this episode, I'll give you a little preview of that conversation, but we had a lot of laughs. And if you really want to hear my struggles, I guess I can say that, but it was a fun conversation where he was giving me advice about letting myself be more open on the internet. And he went through some really crazy stuff. He was canceled before that phrase was even a thing. So he has felt the wrath of the internet in a very real way. And yet at the end of that conversation, he was still encouraging me to go for it anyway. So just kind of fascinating to hear from someone. And if you listen to the interview, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I say he's been through a lot, because he's also so open about everything. So yeah, that interview is in the green room for you right now. And I also want to thank everyone who came to the Austin meetup. It was very fun to meet parts of this community in person. And one of the reasons why I want to do this show with Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton is I feel like that is a show that I can do live and meet more of you in person. Congressional Dish, I tried. Some of you guys remember a few years ago, I was trying to figure out how to do this live, but it's so research intensive. And I just find myself like reading in front of other people, which is just awkward. But the other show, We're Not Wrong, that we could take on the road. And that is how I feel like I can hang out with more of you, because it was so much fun to hang out in Austin. And what was cool about it too is we didn't even really talk about politics. I mean, I guess we did, and governing a little bit, but I really just got to know people and just as people. And so now, even right now, as I'm talking into this microphone, there's faces that I'm thinking of in my head. I'm thinking of Ruben and Ed and Damien and Waffle and Kate and David. Like, I'm thinking of you guys now. Like, there's people on the other end of this, and I want more of that. I'm hungry for more of that. So thank you for coming to meet us in Austin and just, making me a little less afraid of meeting the internet people in person. I never wanted to be a celebrity. I never wanted to chase fame. I never wanted fans. I wanted to do this podcast because there's information I want to get out there. So I'm still learning how to be an internet personality. And you guys supporting me on Patreon and coming to meet me in person and being so kind and wonderful, you're giving me the courage that I need to expand my presence on the internet. So yeah, I'm very appreciative of you guys right now. I'm also very appreciative, as always, for our executive producers. Executive producers are people that have paid a cumulative $535. And every time you do that, you get to put your name, if you want to, on an episode of your choice. It's basically your public vouch. And it is a real credit. You did significantly pay for the costs of that episode, as they were back then. I don't know if we're going to be able to keep the price at $535, because now that we're doing video things and like every episode's more expensive, but that has been a fair price for quite a while. And so you get to put your name, or you can do it anonymously, but you get to put a vouch on an episode. And so when new people come to the show, they can look and see, well, this episode has 2 executive producers. This one has 1. This one has 0. And it really does help people pick which episodes they're going to try now that we have over 250 of them in the catalog. And so George Melter has been supporting this podcast for a while. And this was actually an EP that he earned a while ago, but he told me to apply it to a future episode and announce it on a future episode when we didn't have an executive producer. And so that is what has happened today. So his name is on the 190th episode. It's called A Coup for Capitalism. And that's a fascinating one, because that was the Trump administration's attempt to switch the government in Venezuela. They wanted to get rid of the current president, Nicolas Maduro. And the way they tried to do it was by saying that another dude, Juan Guaido, was the president. And they tried to make that stick, and it didn't work. And so here we are years later, and even the Democrats were in on this. They brought Juan Guaido to the State of the Union. Do you guys remember this? And the whole Congress stood up and gave him a standing ovation, and they announced him as the president of Venezuela. It was bonkers. And yet he's never actually been the president of Venezuela. And now that, Russia, we can't have Russian oil and food, and we're basically like the whole world is sanctioning Russia. Well, Venezuela has the most oil out of anywhere else in the world. And so now the United States government's kind of like, okay, Nicolas Maduro, how about we acknowledge that you are in fact the president, have been the whole time, and maybe we make an oil deal. It's the craziest story. And so A Coup for Capitalism, that's a fascinating episode to go back and listen to, and then look at what's happening now. Yeah, great episode to pick. I'm so happy to have your name on that, George. And thank you, as always, for supporting the show. Okay, so without further ado, here's a very short clip of the interview that I did with Jamie Kilstein. If you are interested in hearing more of this, please go to the Patreon and pledge whatever you think is fair. But yeah, here's Jamie and I. And in this clip, this is when we were talking about how the people that seem to be doing the best financially in political or governmental podcasting, or just media in general, are the ones that have picked a tribe and just preached to their choir. That's a mixed metaphor, but you know what I mean. The Tucker Carlsons, the Rachel Maddows, they've picked a side and they speak only to that side, and they're millionaires because of it. And so we were expressing those frustrations, and we were just talking about how Jamie and I, at this point in our careers, we are trying very hard to not do that and build strong non-tribal communities. And I just really liked this analogy that he had for what he thinks we are doing in this attempt to build a strong non-tribal community. So here is that part of the Green Room episode.
Why are the horrible people getting rewarded so heavily?
I know.
And it's frustrating to watch.
But I guess, like, it's the same advice I would give to, because I've been asking myself that. But then I realized the way you just phrased it, I give advice as a jiu-jitsu coach where people are frustrated at their progress because they're seeing someone who started at the same time, who maybe is more just naturally athletic and gifted, surpass them. And you have to go, hey, dude, you're trying to surpass you. You're not trying to surpass that person.
That's true.
And not only that, I mean, this is actually a fucking, goddamn, this jiu-jitsu analogy. Sometimes I try to crowbar jiu-jitsu analogies in. This one's actually perfect. So when I started, I wasn't athletic. I was out of shape. And instead of being like, oh, I can't be as strong as that guy, or I'm not as young as that guy, or I'm not as fast as that guy, I go, well, what do I have? And this is us being tribalists. What do I have? I go, well, I can be smarter. I can pay more attention. I can take notes. None of these fucking 19-year-olds on roids are taking notes. I cannot have an ego. So instead of just doing the technique wrong as fast as I can when I'm drilling, I can call the coach over every time and go, hey, am I doing this right? And then suddenly, by the time I got a purple belt, everyone who was smashing me, they're still just as big, but I'm fucking destroying them because I've become so much more technical than them, right? Whereas these people who were naturally strong would maybe use their strength and they could do the move a little wrong because they were just stronger or faster or more athletic or whatever. I feel like that's the equivalent of like us playing the long game.
The long game. I really like the way he put that we are playing the long game. And so thanks again for helping us play the long game. I'm going to continue to do all this research and slow and steadily build this amazing community that we have. And my plan for continuing to do that is to next dive into the Ukraine laws. There is a Lend-Lease law. And then I found out this morning that at least $40 billion for Ukraine. It's now law. So I'm going to read that one too and try and figure out where our money is going. And I will have that done for you sometime in June. All right. Thank you so much. I adore you guys. And I will talk to you soon. Probably sooner than later in the green room. So go sign up. All right. Love you. Talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.